On July 23, 1980, 31-year-old Helen Hagnes stood with her husband Janis outside their apartment building on New York's Upper West Side. Helen kissed Janis and told him she would see him later, and then she turned and began walking to work. It was early evening, and Helen could already tell it was going to be another hot New York summer night. It was about 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and it was humid. As Helen walked, she could already feel herself starting to sweat, and she just hoped she would still look okay when she got to work. She was dressed casually in a t-shirt and jeans, but her platinum blonde hair and makeup were perfectly styled, like she was going to a formal event. And in her hand, Helen carried an oblong case that held her most prized possession in the whole world, her violin. Helen had grown up as a musical prodigy, becoming an award-winning pianist at the age of 4 and a skilled violin player at the age of 8. Now, Helen was a highly accomplished violinist, and she had performed with symphonies and opera and ballet companies all over Europe and North America. Helen made her way through the city and eventually turned onto a street about 10 blocks from her house. Up ahead, she saw the Metropolitan Opera House, or the Met as it's known, and her face lit up. Helen had dreamed about playing violin at the Met ever since she was a little girl, and she still couldn't believe that she was getting paid to come to this beautiful opera house to work alongside some of the most talented artists in the world. She turned onto a side street that led around the Met, and she entered through the backstage door. She smiled at a few Met employees and stagehands who were rushing back and forth getting ready for the night's ballet performance. Then Helen walked down a long, brightly lit hallway and went into the dressing room that was reserved for the women in the orchestra. Some of the other musicians had already arrived, and they all talked and laughed while they got dressed. Helen opened her locker and changed out of her street clothes into a black shirt, black pants, and black shoes. She took a blue flower from her locker and fastened it to her hair with a bobby pin. Then, a little before 8 p.m., about an hour after she had arrived, Helen took her place in the orchestra pit with the rest of the musicians. The roar of the applause flooded the theater, the house lights dimmed, the curtain rose, and the orchestra conductor turned to the musicians and waved his hand. Helen felt butterflies in her stomach. Even after all these years of playing, she still got nervous and excited. She raised her violin to her shoulder, placed her bow on the strings, waited for her cue, and started to play. About 40 minutes later, Helen heard the audience applauding once again. She had lost herself in the music like she always did, and so the first act of the ballet had sort of flown by in a blur. The curtain closed and the lights came up. It was the first of 2 intermissions. Helen placed her prized violin on her chair in the orchestra pit and headed backstage. She wasn't playing for the next section of the performance, and so she had an extended break. Helen walked right to the backstage elevator. She wanted to meet with the lead male dancer in the ballet, a famous Russian named Valery Panov. The elevator doors opened, and Helen stepped inside and stood between a man and a young ballerina. Helen told the ballerina she was going to see Panov, but she couldn't remember where his dressing room was. The ballerina said she didn't know either. Panov was a huge star, and he had his own dressing room that was separate from the rest of the dancers. Then the man chimed in and said Panov was on the 3rd floor. Helen thanked him, hit the button for the 3rd floor, and the elevator doors closed. The young ballerina stepped off the elevator at her dressing room floor. Then Helen rode up another floor, got off the elevator, and walked down a long hallway in search of Panov's dressing room. At 11:30 p.m., almost 3 hours after Helen got off that elevator, her husband Janis sat outside the Met in his van. Janis often picked his wife up to drive her home because walking at night in New York City in 1980 could be dangerous. Janis watched the dancers, musicians, and employees filing out of the Met, but he didn't see Helen. So he figured maybe she was still talking to one of her friends in the dressing room. But when it got to be midnight and Helen still had not come outside, Janis thought maybe she was getting a ride home with someone else and she had just forgotten to let him know. So he hopped out of his van, went to the nearest payphone, and called home. But there was no answer. So Janis figured there just must have been some miscommunication between him and his wife, and he headed home. A few minutes later, Janis walked into his and Helen's apartment, and it was empty. Janis thought it was a bit strange Helen wasn't home yet, even if she did get a ride home with someone else. But he figured maybe they had grabbed a drink before heading this way. Then he heard a knock at the door. This had to be Helen, and she must have forgotten her key or something. Janis went to the front door and opened it up, and suddenly he started to get worried. Because a nervous-looking man stood at the door with Helen's violin case in his hands. He said that he and some of the other musicians who played with Helen were really freaked out because Helen had left the orchestra pit during the first intermission and she never came back. He said a group of people had called the apartment and searched for Helen after the show, but they couldn't find her anywhere. Janis took Helen's violin case and he closed his eyes like he was fighting back tears. He knew his wife would never just leave her violin behind somewhere, not even at the Met. In a flat, quiet voice, Janis thanked the man for coming by. Then he closed the door, put down Helen's violin case, and went to the phone and called the police. In the early morning of July 24th, several hours after Janis called the police, Detective Jerry Giorgio of the NYPD walked into the lobby of the Met. The two officers who had arrived first greeted him and showed him the photo they had of Helen Hagnes. Detective Giorgio looked at the photo and heard the lobby doors open behind him. He turned and saw a frantic-looking young woman running in. Giorgio held up his hand to try to get her to slow down and asked if she was okay. She introduced herself and said she was a ballerina in the performance. She had heard about Helen going missing from one of her friends, and she thought she might be able to help, because she was pretty sure she was one of the last people who had seen Helen. The ballerina said that she and Helen happened to be on the backstage elevator together during the first intermission, and Helen had mentioned she was on her way to visit with Panov. Detective Giorgio asked who Panov was. The ballerina smiled and said Valery Panov was one of the most famous male ballet dancers in the whole world. Giorgio thanked her and said her information was a huge help. He got the ballerina's information and told her he would contact her if he needed anything else. As the ballerina walked away, Giorgio handed the photo of Helen back to the two officers and told them to wait there in case anyone else showed up. Then he walked further into the grand lobby of the Met, and the design of the place was like nothing he had ever seen. The huge staircases leading to the higher floors almost looked like they led to nowhere and just disappeared into the darkness. Giorgio had just started to search the lobby when a security guard walked in and introduced himself. His boss had told him to come down and help the police if they needed it. Giorgio was relieved. He said he didn't want to waste any time. He needed a full tour of the opera house. But at this, the security guard busted out laughing. He said that would be impossible. The building was massive, with 6 stories above ground and 3 basements below. And there were so many hallways and hidden rooms that navigating the Met was like walking through a maze. Giorgio said they would get as many cops as they needed to comb through the whole place, but in the meantime, he at least wanted a tour of the backstage area where Helen would have gone during intermission. So the security guard led Giorgio into the theater, up onto the stage, and into the wings. Giorgio looked around the expansive backstage area, and he saw giant set pieces, black curtains hanging everywhere, multiple exits, and an elevator. Then he walked down a stairwell and found himself in a vast, dimly lit basement that made him feel like he was in a horror movie. Giorgio saw cases for double bass instruments that were bigger than him leaned up against the wall. And scattered throughout the basement, he saw old set pieces from past performances and large wooden crates filled with costumes and props. Giorgio started to feel overwhelmed. He thought if the worst had happened, if Helen was dead, her body could be in a crate or an instrument case or in one of the countless dark corners, hiding just out of view. At around 8 a.m., after hours of exploring the depths of the Met, Detective Giorgio went back to the lobby and checked in with the other 2 officers who were still there. He was about to find a phone to call the police station to get more help when a maintenance worker ran inside, and this guy looked like he'd just seen a ghost. Giorgio asked him what was wrong, and the worker said he'd just gone up to the roof of the building to turn on one of the ventilation fans, and while he was up there, he found a pair of women's black shoes, like the ones he'd seen the women in the orchestra wear. Detective Giorgio's heart sank. Helen had disappeared in the middle of a performance, and now her shoes might have been found on the roof. And Giorgio's first thought was that Helen went up there, jumped off the building, taking her own life. Giorgio and the other officers followed the maintenance worker to a service elevator, and they traveled up to the roof in complete silence. The elevator stopped, the doors opened, and Giorgio had to squint as the daylight hit his eyes. The maintenance worker stepped out of the elevator and showed the police the pair of black shoes. Then Giorgio walked to the edge of the building and looked down, but there was nothing on the ground that looked out of the ordinary. So the officers spread out and searched the roof for any additional clues, and within a few minutes, Detective Giorgio heard one of them shout, "Oh my God!" Giorgio whipped around and saw an officer standing by this enormous metal fan, looking through the wide space between two of the blades down into the ventilation shaft. Giorgio joined him and leaned over to look into the shaft as well, and he thought he saw something about 30 feet below, but it was a little dark down there, and he couldn't tell what it was. It took a few seconds for Giorgio's eyes to adjust, but slowly, everything came into focus. There at the bottom, he saw the nude, bloody body of a woman. Shortly after, Detective Giorgio looked down the ventilation shaft and saw the woman's body. An NYPD homicide detective named Mike Struck finished his morning run in Central Park and called into the station to check in for the day. Dispatch told him not to even bother coming into the office. Instead, they said, go straight to the Metropolitan Opera House. Struck rushed home, got cleaned up and changed, and then raced down to the Met. The place was now buzzing with employees and police. And amid the crowd, Detective Struck was happy to see Detective Giorgio. The two men enjoyed working together, and they made a good team. Giorgio was calm and almost fatherly, while Struck was blunt and always seemed like he was moving 100 miles an hour. Giorgio filled Struck in on everything police had found that morning. They had found Helen Hagness's body in a large maintenance tunnel on the 3rd floor. It looked like she had fallen to her death through the ventilation shaft from the roof, but Giorgio was sure someone had pushed her, because her hands and feet had been bound with rope and there was a gag stuffed in her mouth. Giorgio thought the attack could have been sexual, but he had no idea if it was random or if somebody had targeted Helen. Then Struck went to go take Polaroids of Helen's body, and he worked with crime scene technicians as they searched for clues. In addition to a pink bra, they found a pair of black pants, a black shirt, and a blue flower, all near the body. Later that day, several hours after the discovery of Helen's body, the NYPD had set up a fully operational command post inside the offices of the Opera House, and teams of detectives, uniformed police, and forensics technicians scoured the building for more evidence. Not long after the command center got set up, Detective Struck left his and Giorgio's makeshift office, walked into the office of one of the Met's operations managers, and asked how many employees the Met had. But when the manager answered more than 800, all Struck could do was laugh. That was an impossible number of people to interview. Still, he asked the manager for a list of all of those employees, as well as a separate list of the people who were actually working or performing at the Opera House when Helen had disappeared from the orchestra pit. When Struck returned to his office, he found a crime scene technician waiting for him. The tech told Struck they were able to lift a pristine palm print off the outside of that ventilation shaft on the roof. In fact, the print was so good, the tech worried that some careless police officer or other investigator had touched the ventilation shaft that morning and made the print. Struck thanked the tech for the update and asked him to report back as soon as he knew anything, even if it was just to say that a cop had messed up and left that print. Then Struck sat down at what was now his desk, he grabbed his phone, and called Helen's husband, Giannis, and told him he needed to come in to the Met. Detectives Struck and Giorgio sat in their office, reviewing their notes while they waited for their first suspect. Forensics officers and the medical examiner had not found any indication of sexual assault, which made them think it was possible that Helen's murder was actually just staged to look like a sexual assault. And they thought maybe Giannis had met with Helen at some point during the intermission. Then they fought, and he took her up to the roof of the building, where he tied her up and killed her. As the two detectives theorized and talked through the case, the door opened and an officer led Giannis in. Giannis actually stumbled into the room and then collapsed into a chair across from the two detectives. Struck and Giorgio could tell Giannis was drunk just from the smell. And even if they couldn't tell from the smell, the open bottle of Jack Daniels in his hand made it pretty clear. This was a new one for both detectives. They had never seen someone show up to a police interview with a bottle of whiskey. But regardless, the detectives jumped right into the questions. They asked Giannis about his and his wife's relationship. Giannis was slurring his words, but he did manage to tell them that he loved his wife, and he had gone to the Met to pick her up and drive her home, but she had never showed up. Struck and Giorgio listened, but they knew that almost nothing Giannis said in his current state would ever hold up in court. I mean, the guy was drunk. So they told him they would have an officer drive him home, and after he'd gotten some rest, they would follow up with him if they needed to. Later that afternoon, Struck and Giorgio were sitting in the theater when the famous Russian dancer Panov and his interpreter walked in. Panov, according to that ballerina that Giorgio had met that morning, may have been the last person who'd seen Helen alive. Panov took a seat near the detectives and asked how he could help. Then, through his interpreter, he said he did know a musician had gone missing at the Met, but he didn't know anything more than that. Giorgio handed Panov a picture of Helen and said she was the missing musician, and the last time anyone had seen her, she was on her way to meet Panov. Panov looked down at the picture and then said something in Russian. The interpreter then told the detectives that Panov did not know this woman, and she never came to visit him that night, and he had no idea she was even planning to. Then Panov spoke for himself. He explained in broken English that at least 50 people came to visit him every night. It was nothing unusual for audience members or other artists to flood his dressing room. And he tried to meet as many people as he could and be as gracious as he could because he knew that a lot of people had helped him become a ballet star. Struck asked him where he was at the time Helen disappeared during the first intermission. Panov said he had rushed to his dressing room to get changed and then went into the audience. He wasn't in the second part of the ballet, but his wife was, and he loved watching her dance. The detectives knew it would be easy to confirm this if it was true. Audience members and the crew would definitely have noticed one of the most famous dancers in the world walking amongst the crowd. So the detectives told both men they could go. Panov said he was sorry about what had happened to the musician, and then he and his interpreter headed backstage. It was late in the day at this point, and everyone working at the Met was getting ready for that evening's performance. So Giorgio and Struck decided to head home and regroup in the morning. The next day, the detectives walked into the Met lobby and greeted the young ballerina who had flagged down Giorgio the day before to say she had ridden on the backstage elevator with Helen. As far as the detectives knew, she may have been the last person to see Helen alive, other than the killer. So they had asked her to come back to see if maybe she could give them a clearer picture of Helen's movements that night. The detectives led the ballerina to their office, and she sat down across from them. She said she was glad they called her because she had remembered something. When she was in the elevator with Helen, there was a man that was there with them. He had told Helen that Panov's dressing room was on the 3rd floor, and this man was still with Helen when the ballerina got off the elevator. Giorgio and Struck leaned forward. This was huge. It meant that that man on the elevator was either the last witness to see Helen alive, or he was the killer. Struck asked the ballerina if she could describe what this man in the elevator looked like. The ballerina squinted her eyes like she was trying to remember, but she shook her head and apologized. She knew he was a man, but that was about it. Detective Giorgio leaned over to Struck and whispered something in his ear, and Struck nodded in agreement. Then Giorgio turned to the ballerina and said he knew this was going to sound strange, but sometimes the police used a hypnotist to help witnesses remember things in more detail. So Giorgio wanted to know if the ballerina would agree to be hypnotized, and the ballerina said yes. So that afternoon, a hypnotist dimmed the lights in the office and then took a seat across from the ballerina. At the same time, Giorgio and Struck lingered in the corner, and an NYPD sketch artist sat a few feet away, holding his pencil and a sketchbook. The hypnotist told the ballerina to close her eyes and listen only to his voice. And slowly, the hypnotist used his soothing voice and his words to draw the ballerina deeper and deeper into a state of relaxation, until finally she was in a trance. Once she was, the hypnotist asked the ballerina to turn back the clock in her mind to the moment that Helen had stepped on the elevator with her. He asked the ballerina to look closely at the elevator and the man who was there, and to describe him as best as she could. The ballerina concentrated, and she began to speak, describing this man. She said he looked like he was between 20 and 25 years old. He was slightly overweight, had a large nose, brown hair, and bright red lips. And as the ballerina gave these details, the sketch artist began to draw. A few minutes later, the hypnotist gently brought the ballerina out of her trance and turned the lights back on. Police quickly made copies of the sketch and circulated it among the Met's employees. And while they were hopeful, there was the reality that a lot of people could fit the description of a young, slightly overweight guy with brown hair. But later that day, a Met employee walked into the detective's office and told them there was someone they needed to talk to right away. It was a stagehand named Vincent Donahue. Struck asked if Vincent fit the description of the man the sketch artist had drawn. The employee said he did, at least a few days ago, but on the night following Helen's murder, Vincent had showed up to work and he had completely shaved off his brown hair and he had a large scratch on his face. That afternoon, Vincent Donahue took a seat inside the detective's office and he looked annoyed. He said he needed this to be fast because he had a lot of work to do before the performance that night. Giorgio smiled and said he understood, but first he said he had to ask where did that nasty scratch on his face come from. Vincent said he and his girlfriend had gotten into a pretty bad fight a couple of nights ago and his girlfriend used her fingernails when she got angry. Detective Struck quickly jumped in and asked why Vincent had shaved his head. Vincent laughed and said during the argument with his girlfriend where she scratched him, she had said the only good thing about him was his hair. So after she had stormed out of the room, he had shaved his hair off just out of spite. Struck had a look on his face like this seemed totally ridiculous, and Vincent could tell. So Vincent quickly said, "Really, this is the truth." Then he told the detectives he didn't have anything to do with that musician getting killed. And he said instead of wasting time talking to him, they needed to talk to a guy named Craig Crimmins. Vincent said Craig was also a stagehand and he had missed a major cue to move scenery during the second act of the performance on the night Helen died. He had just left his backstage post and disappeared. Now, Struck thought Vincent could still be lying. However, the idea that a stagehand went missing around the same time that Helen went missing was suspicious. So Struck told Vincent he could leave and go back to work, but they might need him again. And as soon as Vincent left the office, Struck and Giorgio sent an officer to track down the stagehand, Craig Crimmins. When Craig stepped into Struck and Giorgio's office, he looked exhausted. Giorgio asked Craig to take a seat, and then once he handed him a photo of Helen and asked Craig if he knew her. Craig glanced at the picture and said he only recognized her from what he had seen in the news. He'd never met her or talked to her. She was a musician, and he didn't really interact with the musicians. Struck just stared at Craig while he spoke. He was young and had brown hair, just like the ballerina's description. So Struck asked if Craig had ridden the backstage elevator at all on the night Helen died. But Craig just shook his head. He said he'd been at his spot backstage the whole performance. Struck leaned across the desk and said if that was true, then why had his colleagues claimed that Craig had been absent from backstage during an important cue that night, specifically during the second act? Craig's face flushed and he stared down at the floor. He said he did miss a cue that night, but he didn't leave backstage. He was embarrassed to admit it to the cops, but he had shown up to work that night drunk and fallen asleep at his post. He told the detectives that another stagehand who worked right beside him backstage had seen him and could back him up that he was telling the truth. Struck and Giorgio questioned Craig a bit longer, and then they let him go. They quickly found the other stagehand Craig had mentioned, and this guy said Craig was telling the truth. He had passed out backstage and basically slept through part of the performance. With Craig's alibi checking out, the detectives still believed they had viable suspects among the other people they had talked to. But they still had hundreds more people to interview, and they still hadn't heard anything about the one major piece of forensic evidence that had been found, the fresh palm print that had been pulled from the ventilation shaft on the roof. So the detectives felt like if they didn't quickly find some new evidence, they were going to be stuck with an overwhelmingly massive suspect pool. 6 days after Helen's murder, on July 29, 1980, her memorial service was held at a New York City church. The church was filled with friends, family, and countless people from the Met. One of Helen's violinist friends performed at the service in her honor. In the 2 weeks following Helen's funeral, Detectives Struck and Giorgio continued their work at the Met, but the Opera House had grown oddly quiet. The ballet had finished its run of performances, and the next show had not opened yet. So the detectives found themselves wandering through the nearly empty, huge building, trying to find anything that they might have missed. But nothing came of those additional searches, and even after weeks of combing through the place, they still felt like there were corners of the Met that remained hidden. But just at the point when the detectives worried their case was about to go cold, Strzok got a call from an excited forensics technician. The tech said he could not believe it, but that nearly perfect palm print found on the ventilation shaft did not belong to a careless police officer or investigator like the forensics team had originally suspected. And it was a relatively fresh print, so it could belong to the killer. When Detective Strzok hung up, he told Giorgio what he just learned, and Giorgio got excited. This palm print was not a smoking gun just yet, but it definitely could be. It was very difficult to access the roof of the Met, so the detectives believed the print had to belong to somebody who worked or performed there, or someone who came by fairly often to visit a family member who worked there. Over the next several days, Opera House employees met with the police in groups of 2s and 3s, and they allowed officers to take their palm prints. And only one of them seemed really nervous about it when asked to give their print, and this was somebody Strzok and Giorgio had already spoken to. This person broke out into a sweat and said that they were uncomfortable with this whole situation. But Detective Giorgio smiled softly, and in his best fatherly voice, he said providing a print was the best way for police to cross them off the list and allow them to put all this behind them. So ultimately, this person agreed and gave their palm print. And when testing on that print came back, Detectives Giorgio and Strzok saw that it was a perfect match to the one found on the roof. And they believed they had found Helen's killer. Based on the palm print, evidence from the scene, and interviews conducted during the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Helen Hagnes on the night of July 23, 1980. The killer saw Helen walking down a hallway on the 3rd floor during the first intermission of the ballet, and they quickly walked down the hall and grabbed her arm. Helen turned around and didn't understand what was happening, but the killer just pulled out a hammer and pushed her into a stairwell. The killer dragged Helen down all the stairs to one of the sub-basements, and then once there, he demanded she take off her clothes. And Helen did. The killer attempted to rape Helen, but they couldn't. And so out of frustration, they demanded Helen put her clothes back on, and then they grabbed her by the arm, and still with the hammer in hand, they led her all the way upstairs to the roof. Once on the roof, the killer once again made Helen get undressed. Except this time, the killer also bound her wrists and her ankles, and they also gagged her. But Helen fought back, and at some point during the struggle, the killer knew they were running out of time. And so out of frustration and panic and anger and embarrassment, they scooped up Helen and they walked over to the air conditioning vent and they placed her on the ledge. And then, as Helen desperately tried to push past them and get back on the roof, the killer just raised up their leg, placed their foot on her side, and they pushed her into the vent. Helen would fall 6 stories to her death. And after she was dead, the killer reached down, scooped up her clothes, and threw them into the vent after her. After that, the killer ran to the door, believing they had disposed of all the evidence. Except they hadn't. They had accidentally left Helen's shoes up on the roof. The killer flew down the stairs all the way to the theater and ran backstage. However, by the time they got there, they were out of time. The intermission was over and the ballet had started again, meaning the killer had missed a very important cue. Craig Crimmins, the stagehand who claimed to have shown up drunk and fallen asleep backstage, killed Helen Hagnes. On the night of the murder, Craig was in fact the man on the elevator with Helen and the young ballerina. And when Helen asked about where Panov's dressing room was, Craig had chimed in and said it was on the 3rd floor. But that was a lie. He was simply trying to trap her. And so when Helen got off the elevator on the 3rd floor, Craig followed her down the hallway, grabbed her, and brought her to the basement, intending to rape her. However, he could not perform sexually, and so in his rage and humiliation, he dragged her up to the roof where he would kill her. Craig did resemble the sketch from the ballerina's hypnosis session. However, it was Craig's palm print on the air conditioning vent that made detectives turn their focus on him. And soon after the detectives discovered Craig's print matched the one on the ventilation shaft, they learned that the other stagehand who said he saw Craig sleeping backstage was lying for his coworker. But he thought Craig had asked him to lie for him just to cover up the fact that he had left backstage and missed an important cue. Craig Crimmins was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 20 years to life. He went on to serve 40 years in prison and was paroled in August of 2021. Was a 26-year-old farmer living in Macon County, Alabama, where 82% of the population at the time was African American, and they were all forced to live under the rules of a strictly segregated society. At the time, the United States was just beginning to crawl out of the Great Depression that had started 3 years earlier, but you wouldn't know it riding through Charlie's town. Like Charlie, many of the other residents in Macon County were completely dirt poor, and they lived in these wooden shacks with no screens on their windows, there was no furniture inside, and they would just throw some dirty rags on the ground to sleep on. On average, the men in the town that were lucky enough to have a job made less than $1 per day. So when Charlie heard a rumor that the government was going to be coming to town and giving free medical exams to all the African American men, Charlie was thrilled. He had never been to a doctor before, and he certainly wasn't going to turn down a free visit to one. And so a couple of days later, the rumor turned out to be true when a government health service worker showed up in their town and set up shop in their one-room schoolhouse. Charlie got in line with the hundreds of other men from Macon County, and then by mid-morning it was his turn, and the health service worker told him that today they were just going to be doing a blood test. And so Charlie eagerly rolled up his sleeve and stuck his arm out. A couple of days later, the results from the blood test had come in, and Charlie was informed that he had bad blood. Bad blood was a commonly used term in that area at the time to describe a wide array of ailments. The worker didn't get into specifics about what Charlie's diagnosis meant. They just told him that in virtue of his diagnosis of bad blood, he was now eligible to join a government-sponsored medical treatment program. If he agreed to be a part of it, he would not only receive medical care for his bad blood, he would also receive free rides to and from the health clinic, he would get a free hot meal on examination days, and in the event he died during the program, his family would be given $50 if they allowed the doctors to perform a thorough autopsy on his body before they buried him. Despite not really understanding what it meant to have bad blood, Charlie decided to join the program, mostly because of those free meals and because he had a deep trust and respect of the government. And Charlie wasn't alone. About 400 other African American men from Macon County agreed to be a part of the program as well. At first, the program was everything they promised it would be. It was just a couple of low-key medical examinations with a nice hot meal, and then occasionally they would take some pills and have another blood draw. But eventually they started being given regular, excruciatingly painful spinal taps that would leave them bedridden for weeks afterwards. But despite this painful and surprising turn of events that none of the men saw coming, they were not aware they would be getting spinal taps as part of this program. Charlie and the other men were convinced this program was still in their best interest and that they could trust the government to eventually cure them of their bad blood. And so Charlie and the other men didn't resist the spinal taps or other follow-on painful and bizarre medical procedures that they were being told was good for them and would help them get rid of this bad blood. Less than a year later, men in this program began getting sick. They started developing rashes and sores all over their body. Their bones and joints would ache. They began losing hair. They had indigestion. They had headaches. They had constant fevers. And for some of the men, these symptoms would eventually subside. But for others, they got dramatically worse. For those men, they would develop tumors and their bones would start to disintegrate. They would go blind or deaf or become paralyzed, or they would simply die. But despite the obvious ineffectiveness of this treatment program, it persisted. When America entered World War II in 1941, Charlie and many of the other men in this program wanted to enlist in the military and go join the fight. But when they went to enlist, they were told that as members of this special medical program, they could only receive treatment from the doctors in that program. And so they could not receive treatment from military doctors and therefore were disqualified from military service. While frustrated by this rule, Charlie and many of the other men still considered themselves to be very fortunate to be allowed to be a part of this program that was curing them of their bad blood. And Charlie specifically felt like he was one of the luckiest men inside of this program because his bad blood had not led to these terrible symptoms that his friends were experiencing. And so over the years, in between his medical appointments, Charlie got married, he had a child, he even managed to buy a little plot of land that he farmed on nearly year-round. Then, in 1973, so over 40 years after they began this medical program, Charlie and the other survivors of this program had their lives completely turned upside down. That year, a very junior assistant within the Public Health Service secretly mailed off all of the records of this Macon County medical program to the Associated Press. And then a couple of days later, the Washington Star newspaper ran this huge story on their front page that said syphilis victims in United States study went untreated for 40 years. It would turn out Charlie and the other 400 men in this medical program, they didn't have bad blood. That was just kind of a made-up term to get them not to ask any questions. What they had was syphilis, a deadly disease that ravages the human body in 3 stages that can unfold over a lifetime. And so these doctors that treated Charlie were not actually treating him. They knew he had syphilis. That was why he was even part of the program to begin with. When they tested his blood, they were trying to see who had syphilis in Macon County, and then they took those people and they entered them into this phony program, not to make them better, because this was not a treatment program. It was a US government-backed medical study of what happens to African American men with syphilis if their condition goes completely untreated for their entire lives. The leaders of the study did not care what happened to these men. And that point was made crystal clear when in the 1940s, a cure for syphilis was discovered, penicillin. But instead of giving it to these men and saving their lives, they intentionally hid the cure from them and prevented them from getting it. This is why these men were not allowed to enlist in the military or seek outside medical care, because those doctors would discover these men had syphilis and they would just give them penicillin, curing them, but that screwed up the study, and so they couldn't have that. The Public Health Service chose Macon County, Alabama, because at the time, 35% of the population was already infected with syphilis, and because they knew the men in this town would be largely uneducated and poor and desperate, and therefore easy to trick into joining this highly unethical study. At least 28 men in the study died as a result of their syphilis infections, and countless others suffered from long-term side effects. Charlie was 66 years old when he heard the news. Finally, he had an answer. Bad blood meant he had syphilis, but fortunately his syphilis had either burned out or gone dormant. But he thought about all the other men in the study that had not been as lucky, and Charlie felt so betrayed by the government. He and the rest of the men had no idea they were getting taken advantage of. Charlie got in touch with a lawyer who eventually sued the federal government, and in an out-of-court settlement, Charlie and the other 73 survivors of the so-called Tuskegee experiment were given $38,000 each as compensation. After the settlement, Charlie just went back to his simple life in Macon County, and then 27 years later, on April 29, 2000, Charlie passed away at the age of 94. Our next story is called Suspended. On the evening of March 15th, 2018, a 55-year-old man named Jian stumbled out of this fine dining restaurant in downtown Singapore and promptly threw up on the sidewalk. Pedestrians jumped back to get out of the way, and a woman in high heels and a beautiful fancy dress mumbled something insulting about how drunk Jian must be. But Jian was not drunk. He was totally sober, and now he was absolutely mortified. Jian was actually a businessman who was attempting to impress his clients at dinner, but as he had been sitting at the table with his clients, he had started to feel this pressure in his chest that became so intense that at some point he just had to get up and run outside and vomit. And so after Jian had stood up and wiped his mouth, he thought, now that he had been sick and thrown up, that he would feel better. But as he was standing there, he noticed the pressure in his chest had not been relieved at all. And so, as much as Jian wanted to stick around and talk more with his clients, he felt like the only thing he could do now was to go in and politely excuse himself for the rest of the night and just go home and sleep off whatever was going on with him. But when Jian went back into the restaurant and was actually back at his table, before he could even say a sentence to his clients explaining the situation, he was turning around and running back outside and vomiting on the street again. At this point, Jian knew something was definitely wrong, and so he didn't have time to tell his clients what was going on. He just needed to get to a hospital. And so he sprinted across the street, got in his car, and began driving. When he got to the hospital, he was so scared about what was happening to him that he actually parked his car crooked in the spot and left his door open as he sprinted towards the emergency room. And then once he was inside the hospital, he ran up to the receptionist and tried to tell them what was going on, but he literally couldn't speak, and then he just collapsed in a chair right nearby. Now, the hospital was extremely busy, but all the nurses could tell whatever was going on with this man, it could not wait. And so they ran over to him, they lifted him up, they put him on a stretcher, and they wheeled him into a private exam room. And then once he was in there, they began taking his vitals, and also they began assessing him, looking for some sort of trauma on the outside of his body that could explain what was going on with him, but they couldn't find anything. And so after they were sure that Gian was stable, he was breathing okay, his heart rate was okay, he just couldn't speak, but he was going to be okay, the team decided that the next thing they should do would be to give him a CT scan. A CT scan is a specialized type of imaging that can show what's going on inside someone's body. It's like a really detailed X-ray. And after they gave Gian a CT scan, his results were baffling. There was this solid, fairly large, white object that was lodged at the base of Gian's esophagus. Your esophagus sits below your throat and above your stomach. It's basically the tube that food goes through to get to your stomach. But whatever was stuck inside of Gian's esophagus was not something that looked like food. It actually kind of looked like a human hand. Now, the doctors had no idea what this thing was, and you gotta remember that they really don't have much information here. All they know is this middle-aged guy who's dressed really well has come running into the hospital, he can't speak, and he's collapsed, and here we are. He has this obstruction in his esophagus. And so even though the doctors really had no idea what they were dealing with, what they knew is they had to get this foreign object out of Gian. So they wheeled Gian into the operating room for emergency surgery, and then at some point a doctor came in with this long skinny tube that had a camera at the top of it. Their first step for this operation was putting this camera down into Gian to see what this thing was that was stuck inside of his esophagus. And so after Gian was prepped for surgery, the doctor with this camera began snaking it down Gian's throat until finally the camera could actually see this white object in his esophagus. And when the camera revealed what this thing was, the entire medical team in the operating room just gasped. They could not believe what they were looking at. To understand what they were looking at, we have to go back several hours. That night, Gian had decided he really wanted to impress his wealthy clients. And so he had decided to take them to this very special restaurant that none of them had been to, and he wanted them to try a very special and very rare dish that this restaurant sold. It was called sanakji. Sanakji is a Korean delicacy that is very popular in certain circles, but it's also very dangerous. Every year in South Korea, at least 6 people die from eating sanakji. Because sanakji is just a living octopus. You literally eat the octopus as it's moving around, and the risk of it getting stuck in your throat is pretty high. And so as Gian is trying to eat this living octopus, the octopus decided it didn't want to be eaten, and so it flailed its tentacles around, and finally its suckers lodged onto his esophagus, and that's where it stopped. Now, we don't know how long this octopus remained alive inside of Gian's esophagus, but we know it was alive at least for a little bit, because after Gian managed to swallow it down, it kept wriggling around and grabbing and trying to escape, and that's what created that intense pressure in Gian's chest and kept causing him to go vomit. And so when the doctors put that camera down Gian's throat, they saw a whole octopus. The octopus was removed from Gian's esophagus, and 2 days later, Gian was discharged, fully recovered. It's unclear if Gian ever tried sanakji again. The next and final story of today's episode is called Earworm. On the night of May 29, 2007, a 29-year-old man named Romy Baligula sang to himself as he and a big group of his friends wandered into a karaoke bar in the city of San Mateo in the Philippines. Life had not been easy lately for Romy, but tonight he was feeling good. He and his buddies had begun drinking alcohol about an hour earlier, and so he already had a nice buzz as he walked into this bar. He had a brand new shirt on, and for the first time in weeks, Romy actually had money in his pocket. Romy had lost his job a couple of months earlier, and since then, he had not been able to find new employment. And so this city he was living in, San Mateo, even though it was one of the wealthiest places in all of the Philippines, it was also known as a place that had lots of poverty and really no safety net for people that fall on hard times. And so if you lose your job, like Romy had, you could find yourself out on the streets really quickly, looking for scrap metal to sell, and dumpster diving just to find your next meal. And that's exactly what Romy had been doing for the better part of the last 2 months. He had been living out on the streets. But just a day earlier, he had discovered this stash of very valuable scrap metal, and he had sold it that day for a nice profit. And with that money, he had bought a nice big dinner, a brand new shirt, and tonight he had bought a night out. And the best kind of night out for Romy was going to a karaoke bar. Because Romy loved to sing, and his friends did too, but Romy sang basically all the time. Whether he was full-time employed, making lots of money, enjoying life, or if he was in a dumpster looking for food to eat, Romy would be singing. Now, Romy was not the best singer, certainly not compared to some of his friends who were excellent singers, but he felt like the more he sang, the better he got. And he was kind of proud that he felt like he was progressing and becoming a better and better singer. And Romy's favorite songs to sing were these big ballads. He just loved to close his eyes and let the words of the story kind of take him away. It really was his escape. It was like no matter how bad his life got, he could always sing and that would make him feel better. Once Romy and his friends went inside the karaoke bar, they made their way across the very crowded space to the far side of the bar. They found 2 unoccupied tables, they pushed them together, they all sat down, and then they ordered a round of beers. And then after the beers came, the friends all did a toast to their wonderful night out they were having. And then, one by one, each of Romy's friends began getting up and making their way over to the karaoke machine and began going through all the music and deciding which songs they were going to sing that night. One of Romy's friends chose an American country song. Another one of his friends chose a pop song from the 1980s about unrequited love. But regardless of the songs that any of Romy's friends chose, when they began getting up there and singing their song, it was like the karaoke bar came alive. People in the Philippines love karaoke. It's really a part of the culture. In fact, many people in the Philippines have a karaoke machine of their own in their house. And so what that means is in karaoke bars like the one Romy was at, the crowd is both really appreciative of good singers who go up there and do karaoke really well, and everyone will get up and cheer and dance along. And then also, if there are bad karaoke singers, the crowd is just as quick to begin jeering and booing at them and getting them to stop. And Romy knew that when he went up on stage that night, he was taking a bit of a risk, because when he went up and identified the song that he was going to sing, he knew it was a questionable choice. But he was confident in his abilities. He had been singing and practicing. He really felt like he was ready to nail this really challenging song, and the crowd was going to love him for it. As Romy sat at the table watching one of his friends perform a fast-paced song about a race car, the bar's bouncer, a 43-year-old man named Robalito Ortega, came over to Romy's table with a big grin on his face. Robalito didn't recognize Romy or his friends. They were new at this bar, and so Robalito wanted to introduce himself and get to know these people. One, because Robalito was a big karaoke enthusiast, just like everybody else was. And two, Robalito felt like it was easier to keep the peace in this bar when everybody knew him and he knew everybody. And so Romy and his friends, they chatted happily with Robalito, and then after Romy's friend, who was singing the song about the race car, wrapped up and came down off the stage, Robalito gave him a nice congratulatory pat on the back and told the friend he did a great job up there. And the friend, in turn, turned around and flagged down the bartender at the other side of the bar and kind of gestured, "Hey, we want another round of drinks." And the friend also made it clear that he wanted to give a drink to the bouncer as well, as like a thank you to the bouncer for giving him the compliment. And the bouncer said, "Thank you very much." And then before long, the beers arrived, and Romy and his friends and the bouncer, they all cheersed and toasted the night and enjoyed their drinks together. And then just a couple of minutes later, it was Romy's turn to take the stage. And so he got up and, as confidently as he could, kind of jogged up onto the stage, and he took the microphone and he looked out at the crowd. And everybody's having a great time. It seemed like the mood was really positive, and Romy really felt like, again, even though this song was a questionable song choice, that this crowd was going to love it and that he was going to do a wonderful job. But when the song began to play in the background, Romy noticed that right away, the mood in the bar completely shifted. It went from loud, happy, and talkative to almost silent as everybody in the bar turned and looked up at the person who had chosen this song. But Romy had anticipated this, and he knew as soon as he actually began singing this song that he could win them over. He was going to nail this song. And sure enough, Romy began to sing, and right away it was like the mood began to kind of return to what it was. People in the audience could tell that Romy was doing a good job, and so about a third of the way into his song, Romy noticed that the bar was basically back to normal. He even looked over and saw the bouncer, who was still standing with his friends over at the table, had raised his beer, kind of saying, "Keep it up, you're doing great." And when Romy saw the bouncer really getting into it, Romy had this surge of adrenaline, and suddenly he felt so confident that he really leaned into the song. And so he began dancing on stage and really belting out each of the lines of the song. But at some point in the song, there's this moment where the singer really needs to hit a high note, and when Romy very confidently attempted to hit this high note, his voice cracked, and it was a really loud, obvious cracking of his voice, and it kind of threw Romy off rhythm, and he couldn't really get back on rhythm, and so right away, the audience reacted by going quiet again and looking angrily up at Romy like, "We knew you were going to screw this up, this was a bad choice," and Romy actually looked over and saw the bouncer. And now the bouncer had his beard down and he's glaring angrily at Romy like, "What are you doing?" But Romy, even though he was kind of faltering here, he did his best to kind of regain his composure because he knew he had practiced this song so many times. He knew he could do it, and he tried so hard to get back on track, but he just couldn't do it. And it was around this point that he looked back at Robolito, the bouncer. And all he would have seen is Robolito angrily belting out the words of this song, almost like he was trying to override how badly Romy was singing it. And then at some point, as Romy is staring at Robolito, Robolito, while singing this song, pulls out a gun, aims it at Romy, and fires. In the Philippines, there is one song that everybody knows you do not sing. In fact, this song is often banned in most karaoke bars, and then even when it's not banned, nobody sings it. And the reason this song is so forbidden is because since 1998, people have begun being murdered for singing it. Reasons unknown, but it just keeps on happening. Since 1998, 12 people have been murdered either while they were singing this song for karaoke or immediately after it. The forbidden song is called My Way by Frank Sinatra, and that was the song that Romy chose. Now, no one really understands why this song somehow elicits all this violence in people in karaoke bars in the Philippines, but it does. Some have said that the message of the song, which is about a man being a man and doing it his way, kind of brings out a lot of masculine energy amongst people that are listening to it, and it can apparently prompt people to just suddenly start acting violent. But that's just a theory. No one really understands why this song just keeps leading to murders. But on May 29th, 2007, when Romy sang this song, Robolito the bouncer, who liked Romy and liked his friends and was having a nice drink with them, he just couldn't handle it when the song was getting butchered, and he hated the song to begin with, and in fact, ironically, Robolito had been hired by that karaoke bar specifically to keep the peace if the song were to come on, but as he listened to this song, something happened inside of him, and he pulled his gun and shot and killed Romy. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, Mr. Ballen Podcast, and we also have Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts.